Today should be heralded as a day of national mourning for a man whose talents were wasted, for the intractable legacy of sexual harm he left behind. Hugh Hefner's legacy is nothing to be celebrated. He was not a revolutionary, he was not a folk hero, and he was definitely not a champion of free speech. He was a pioneer in the sexual objectification and the exploitation of women. And as a result, we are suffering from a crisis right now of sexual exploitation, particularly aimed at women because of him.
Yeah, so we thought we'd share a little bit of the history of the development of how Playboy came into being and why it gained so much popularity. So in 1950, Hugh Hefner read Alfred Kinsey's book on I'm blanking on the name. It was Al Kinsey's book, which is revolutionary on sexual behavior in the human male. And he basically became enthralled with this book and decided that he was going to become Kinsey's pamphleteer, was the way that Hefner put it. Now, this set him on the path where he eventually decided that he would develop a magazine, which he eventually decided on the name Playboy. And the inaugural issue came out in December of 1953. And what made the issue so impactful was the fact that Hefner had been able to secure some nude photos of Marilyn Monroe, color photos even. So, and before this time, there had not been a magazine to expose women's nipples weren't usually shown in pornography, and it being shown in full color like this in a nicer kind of magazine was a really big deal.
Let me just say, one of the earliest marketing tactics that Playboy used was they bought mailing lists of like everyone in the United States, and they just mailed out copies of Playboy magazine to everyone. So families were getting it, children were being exposed, and this was in the late 50s.
Early 50s.
When they did the mailing.
Oh, the mailing. Okay.
Yeah. They just sent it to like every home in America completely unsolicited.
And from the beginning, we need to be clear that Hefner was a misogynist.
Yeah, let's talk about some of this.
Yeah, I mean, he hated women, and he made it very clear that this magazine wasn't going to be for women, and that women should just, ignore it. So actually, this is what he said in the inaugural issue. We want to make it very clear from the start that we aren't a family magazine. If you're somebody's sister, wife, mother-in-law, and you picked us up by mistake, please just pass us along to the man in your life and get back to the ladies' home companion. So, ladies, I'm sure, he was basically telling us that we should all know our place.
And really, he's the one who has really pushed this idea that women are simply objects to be used, abused, and completely discarded. For 50 years, that's what he's pushed in his magazine and in this lifestyle that he's promoted.
He's actually referred to women as dogs. So,
and a lot worse, I think.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that made Playboy so popular was the fact that he put forward this idea of the Playboy lifestyle. And basically, it was supposed to be a philosophy. I would add that it's not a very deep philosophy, but this is how he promoted it as a way of life. And he expounded upon this idea as, that the Playboy can be someone who's a sharp-minded businessman, an executive, a worker in the arts, a university professor, an architect, an engineer. He can be many things, provided he possesses a certain kind of view. He must be an alert man, a man of taste, a man sensitive to pleasure,
sexual pleasure,
and who, without acquiring the stigma of a voluptuary, I need to work on that one, or a dilettante, can live life to the hilt. So it was this the idea that it was all about pursuing pleasure and kind of just setting up this an image that men who consume pornography could be cool and that they could live a jet-setting lifestyle.
And look how successful he's been. I mean, just go to the next slide. And look at all these people that have also portrayed, and I mean, in pop culture, we see this Playboy lifestyle glamorized and legitimized through all over the place. But also, we're seeing that Hugh Hefner was so successful. Now we do have judges, and we have doctors, and we have lawyers, and teachers, and pastors who are completely 100% addicted to hardcore pornography and have this mindset that Hugh Hefner had that women should be used, abused, and discarded. Playboy set our culture and society on the path where it is so normal, where everyone is expected to be looking at women in this way.
Yeah, and I would say that, just for example, these actors who kind of personify the Playboy lifestyle, or at least at some point in their lives, it was really this idea of detachment, of remaining emotionally aloof, of using women for sexual pleasure, but remaining aloof from them and not developing real sincere attachments to them. And that was really part of the whole Playboy image. And then ultimately what happens, because of the strategies that Hefner employed, using images that were evocative of the girl next door, which really played to the idea of male sexual fantasies that romanticize young teenage girls who were cute and lovely, as opposed to a lot of the pornography of the past, which had used older women and women who actually had a little more of a, how would you even say it, more hardened look. By using this image of the girl next door, it really popularized pornography, and eventually Playboy became seen as American as apple pie. And its peak circulation was over 7 million copies a month.
And adding to this, what you were just talking about, how because Playboy tried to portray women as like the girl next door, like not the woman next door, the girl next door, we now have mainstream, very popular themes of pornography are child themed, are teen themed, and Playboy really set the course for that. The number one search term of pornography today is the word teen, and among the top 10 search terms are other teen related words. And this is, you can see, can you show some of the pictures of how Playboy portrayed children and teens in their magazine over the years?
Now, I imagine for those of you out there, you might not be able to see this clearly, but this is a cartoon that was published in Playboy in 1977. In this particular example, it's a young woman, young girl. She could very easily be a child. It's really hard to tell. But the man has ransacked the house. He's been burglarizing it, and in the meanwhile, he's tied her up and
stripped her clothes off.
And apparently, sexually molested her or assaulted her in some way. And the caption is, "Before you go, would you mind tightening my ankles a little bit?" So the idea here is suggesting it's promulgating a rape myth that women want to be raped, that they enjoy being raped, and it's right here in a Hefner cartoon.
And it's okay to do it to young girls.
Yeah. And it's important to recognize that men were looking at this material for sexual stimulation. So by looking at this, gratifying themselves, they're actually shaping their sexual templates to this, by this idea that women enjoy sexual assault and being raped. Here's another really horrifying example. Do you want to do this one, Dawn?
Yeah, Playboy normalized child sexual abuse. There's actually quite a lot of research on examples from Playboy in the past. If you look up Dr. Judith Reisman, or Dr. Diana Russell. But in this one, the caption under this image, which is a young child, says, "This is Jane. When she is nice, she is very, very nice. But when she is naughty, she has to be punished. Lately, Jane has been very, very naughty." That's why in the current issue of We Magazine, Jane is pictured in a variety of poses that restrict her movement. So you see, it's for her own good and not incidentally your pleasure. But this is a young girl depicted in this picture, and there are other very childlike images used throughout the decades in Playboy magazine.
And the caption here is how one family solved its discipline problem.
So within the family,
yeah,
normalizing sexual. Show the next slide, because this one, I think, back one. Forward. This one.
What?
The cartoons.
There we go.
Here also are more images normalizing child sexual abuse, and in the captions here, it indicates that a child's uncle is cavorting with the child. They're even using the word molestation, and that they're playing a game called Consequences.
Yeah, the middle one here, I think the setting is something like a swimming pool or something like that, where somebody's coming out of a changing room, and the older man in his robe, and the girl's coming out, and she's saying, "You call that being molested?" And then, yes, you want to do that?
Yeah, this one shows a young girl in bed with an older man, and it says, "Everything is fine, Mama. Uncle William and I are playing a game called Consequences." How many families have experienced sexual abuse and incest within the family? This is so rampant right now, and I would argue it's partly so rampant and such a big problem because Playboy completely normalized it, sexualized it, and glamorized it.
And another really blatant example of the ways that Playboy normalized the idea of child sexual abuse. Here you've got an example of a woman who's been made to look like a child, very intentionally made to look like a child. She's sitting in an oversized rocking chair. She's holding a stuffed toy. She's got the child like Mary Jane type shoes on. She's surrounded by stuffed animals, and she's topless, of course. So here we've got, again, another really blatant example of how Playboy was normalizing and setting male sexual appetites to be groomed towards children.
And I'll just point out here, like, there's an article in this issue with the California governor, and Hugh Hefner would always push this idea that Playboy was for like the educated and people are reading it for the articles. People were not reading Playboy for the articles. They were looking at this because they were participating in the abuse and the use and the disregard of women, and that's what really was being pushed throughout the decades.
And I think this is a good time to add the point that there's a fascinating YouTube interview where Hugh Hefner is being interviewed. It's an old interview, black and white interview, and in this discussion, he actually says to the reporter that the reporter's asking, well, how old do you think people should be before they're allowed to look at Playboy, or if Playboy could be harmful? And Hefner goes on to expound that basically he thinks that as long as the child is of sound and healthy mind, that as young as 6 years old is okay for a child to be looking at a magazine like Playboy.
Let's talk a little bit more. We have some more examples of how they depicted women as children and teen-like. But I want to get into a little bit more about his true legacy, which I would argue right now is this: that America is suffering this public health crisis of pornography, suffering from addiction and lifelong dependencies and struggles of with adults and children starting this struggle.
Right. The public health harms of pornography are very wide-ranging, and we've done a lot of work here at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation to go through the research, to pull it together, and we've developed a research summary, which it's just scratching the surface. We haven't begun to go through the amount of...
There's reams of research about the public health harms.
And they're in really broad areas, like everything that from connecting pornography, correlating it to violence against women, to adolescents being sexually victimized by their peers who look at pornography, and also to becoming perpetrators due to the attitudes that they're imbibing through pornography. Then we've got things like the impacts on women, the low self-esteem, the depression that they experience as a result of their partners using pornography, the impact on relationships.
Yeah, I mean, how so many relationships have been broken and torn apart because of pornography, and the ensuing consequences from that. We know also that pornography is very much connected to increased demand for trafficked women and children. I actually remember meeting with 3 survivors of human trafficking over at what's that school that's just in Virginia? Mason.
Oh, George Mason.
George Mason College, which is near us. And 3 survivors were speaking, and I asked them, hey, have you ever had a buyer or a John bring pornography and ask you to do it? And all of them talked about how pornography was brought to a date, and they were asked to perform what they saw in pornography. And 2 of them actually talked about how Playboy was brought to this, to their meetup, and how they were asked to pose like the girls in Playboy, and like they took pictures. I mean, it's so interconnected, pornography and trafficking, and I would argue, Playboy is, there's a legacy, all right. It's not a legacy of free speech.
No, And if you think about that legacy and how it's impacting day-to-day, real-life, the consequences that we see even played out on national stage, people who, the types of people that Hefner hung out with and were partying at the Playboy mansion include the likes of Roman Polanski, a known sexual predator, Bill Cosby, who's of course been at the center of a firestorm over all the sexual assaults that he's allegedly perpetrated. So, there's a time to start connecting some dots here, people.
He passed away, and I don't think we should be talking about his legacy of all the good he did. There's not much good he did. We need to talk about the reality and the truth, the dark side that sadly so many Americans and individuals are struggling and suffering from because of Hugh Hefner's choices, the way he chose to spend his life.
Yeah, Hefner succeeded in normalizing and popularizing pornography in a way that no other pornography companies have been able to do. And after it launched and became so popular, there was a flood of folks who tried to emulate his style, who tried to copycat, and then eventually you get to the publishers like Guccione and Larry Flint and guys who are doing Penthouse and Hustler, their strategy was to actually remove the veneer, the gloss that Hefner had put on pornography to try to make it more palatable and normalized and acceptable, and just be raw and blatant in their objectification of women. And they pushed that envelope to more and more extremes. And then we get the advent of DVDs, VHS, which start bringing pornography even more into the home. And then you've got the internet and the explosion of internet pornography. So ironically, by the end, by the time we reach today's era, today's time, Playboy in a way has become obsolete. It's a relic of its own success because it was just not relevant anymore because there were so much copious amounts of pornography out there on the internet, and sadly, overwhelmingly just violent and degrading and debased in the kind of content that it's putting out there. Really body punishing sex where women are just so brutalized and portrayed in really savage ways, very sexually calloused ways. So this is the legacy that we're inheriting, and now we've got a whole generation of millennials who are consuming this material on a daily basis. It's a staggering problem that is going to literally forever change the fabric of our society. We've really got to start addressing it now.
Well, we hope that you'll help share the true legacy of Hugh Hefner as you're speaking out also and helping to raise awareness. How can we value or applaud or accept Hugh Hefner and his messages about the value of women he unleashed when we're really suffering from campus sexual assault, military sexual assault, culture of sexual harassment in Silicon Valley, and so much domestic violence, so much sex trafficking. Our courts are overwhelmed with child exploitation. That's the real legacy, and we need to be talking about that. The consequences of the last 50 years that Playboy is actually really just another brand for old-fashioned misogyny. With that, we'll leave it there. Share this, speak up, talk about the real legacy of Hugh Hefner.